The forest was unnaturally quiet that night, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel like a betrayal. I'd worked as a park ranger for years, long enough to know that the woods come alive after dark. Owls hoot, crickets chirp, and leaves rustle under the feet of nocturnal creatures. But not tonight. Tonight, the air was still, the shadows stretched long, and a sense of foreboding wrapped itself around me like a second skin. Then through the static of my radio, a woman's voice tore through the quiet, raw with panic. "Help, please, someone help us, there's a bear, he's hurt. Oh my God, it's coming back!" The words hit like a slap, my heart rate spiking. I didn't wait for the dispatcher's full response. Grabbing my gear, I bolted to my truck. The adrenaline coursing through my veins turned the distance between me and the deep woods campsite into a blur. The call had come from an area so isolated it wasn't even marked on the park maps. My gut churned. People weren't supposed to camp there. It was too far from safety, too deep into the wild, too close to something primal. The trail to the campsite felt more like a descent into another world. The trees closed in overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky, and the ground seemed to swallow every step I took. By the time I arrived, the flashlight beam felt insignificant against the dense, oppressive darkness. Then I saw them, two figures clinging to a tree like frightened children. The woman, no older than her mid-20s, was gripping her phone with one hand, its screen casting an eerie glow on her pale, tear-streaked face. The man above her looked worse, his shirt soaked in blood, his breath ragged and shallow. But it was the bear that stole my focus. A massive black bear prowled at the tree's base, its fur glistening like wet ink in the moonlight. It moved with slow, deliberate steps, its shoulders rolling with raw power. Every few moments it stopped to sniff the air, its breath fogging in the cold night. I raised my voice, keeping it steady despite the pulse hammering in my ears. "Stay calm, I'm here to help." The woman looked down at me, her eyes wide and wild. "Are you the ranger? Oh my God, please get us down, it's going to kill us." Her voice echoed through the woods, too loud, too sharp. The bear's ears twitched and its head swiveled toward the sound, its dark eyes gleaming. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my tone low. "It just came out of nowhere," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "We were camping and I guess it smelled the food." "Where was the food?" She hesitated, her face twisting with guilt. "In the tent." My stomach sank. Rookie mistake. No, worse than that, reckless. I'd spent years drilling these rules into campers. No food in the tent, no trash left out, no cooking near your sleeping area. But a quick glance around their makeshift campsite told me they hadn't followed a single rule. Scattered marshmallows, half-eaten sandwiches, candy wrappers, and an empty beer can, all of it lay strewn across the ground like breadcrumbs leading the bear straight to them. They hadn't just ignored the warnings, they'd practically rolled out a red carpet for disaster. The bear turned its massive head toward me, sniffing the air, its nostrils flared and its breath came in heavy, audible huffs. I tightened my grip on the bear spray hanging from my belt. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Get out of here!" The bear stopped pacing and locked eyes with me. For a moment it was like staring into a black hole, an abyss of instinct and hunger. Then it roared. The sound was primal, a deafening rumble that made my chest vibrate. The woman shrieked, nearly dropping her phone, and the bear surged forward, its muscles rippling under its sleek coat. I raised the bear spray and let loose a burst of orange mist, aiming for its face. The bear reared back, pawing at its eyes, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it turned toward me, its lips peeling back to reveal teeth like curved daggers. What followed was a blur of chaos. The bear charged, closing the distance faster than I thought possible. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a root, and hit the ground hard. Its claws swiped just inches from my leg as I rolled to the side, grabbing a thick branch in desperation. When it lunged again, I swung the branch with every ounce of strength I had, striking its snout. The bear snarled and reared up on its hind legs, towering over me. My mind raced, weighing options I didn't have. Above me, the man shouted, his voice hoarse but defiant. "Over here, you ugly bastard." Blood was still dripping from his side, but he waved his arms wildly, drawing the bear's attention. It hesitated, torn between me and the noise from above. That hesitation saved my life. I scrambled for the bear spray, finding it just as the bear dropped back to all fours. I fired again, the spray hitting it square in the face. This time the effect was immediate. With a roar that shook the ground, the bear backed away, shaking its head violently before lumbering off into the shadows. The woods felt suffocatingly silent once more. "Is it gone?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," I said, my own voice shaking. "But we're not safe yet. We need to get out of here." Helping them down was no easy task. The man's injuries were severe. Deep gashes raked across his side, but adrenaline seemed to keep him upright. As I wrapped a makeshift bandage around his wounds, I couldn't help but glare at the woman, who was still clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Are you seriously live streaming this?" I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. "People need to know what happened," she argued, her tone defensive. "They need to know not to be as careless as you," I shot back. The hike back to the trailhead felt like it stretched on forever. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had us jumping at shadows, our nerves frayed to their breaking points. When we finally emerged from the woods, an ambulance was waiting, its lights casting a cold, sterile glow over the scene. As the medics loaded the man onto a stretcher, I turned back toward the forest. The air still carried the bear's scent, a sharp, earthy musk that clung to my senses. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up their mess. Every wrapper, every scrap of food, every ember of their fire, it all had to go. The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, and I couldn't let their carelessness invite more danger. The couple never returned to the park, as far as I know, but their story stayed with me, not because of the bear, but because of what it revealed about human nature. Out here, the rules aren't just suggestions, they're survival. One mistake, one moment of ignorance can cost you everything, and sometimes you don't get a second chance. The forest was alive in the way only deep wilderness could be. Where the air hangs heavy, the shadows stretch long, and every sound feels like it's coming from just over your shoulder. That night the trees seemed to breathe, their skeletal branches swaying ever so slightly despite the still air. I've always loved the woods, but I'd learned long ago that they don't love us back. As a park ranger, I'd seen my fair share of what happens when people underestimate the wilderness. Usually it's something manageable, hikers losing their way, campers forgetting essentials, or the occasional injury. But every now and then, something happens that reminds you just how unforgiving nature can be. It was a call about a missing hiker. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. A man named David Wires had gone out on a solo hike the day before and hadn't returned. His car was still parked at the trailhead, and the trail he'd taken wasn't considered dangerous. Long, yes, with dense woods and steep inclines, but nothing that should have been deadly. People wandered off trails all the time. They'd usually turn up cold, scared and embarrassed, but alive. That's what I was expecting when I grabbed my gear and set out with my partner Mike. I was wrong. The call came in just before sunset. We didn't waste time. Every minute counted once nightfall set in. The trail stretched before us like a dark ribbon winding deeper into the forest. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, turning the woods into a maze of shifting shapes. "This'll be a quick one," Mike said, his tone casual. "Probably twisted his ankle and couldn't hike back. Happens all the time." I nodded, but a strange unease crept over me. There was no logic to it, just a feeling like the forest was holding its breath. We hiked in silence, calling David's name every so often. The woods didn't answer. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just the crunch of our boots on the dirt trail. The absence of sound was oppressive, wrapping around us like a thick fog. Then we found the first sign. A water bottle lay just off the trail, half buried in the dirt. Mike picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "It's his," he said, pointing to the label. "Looks fresh. He must have come this way." We pressed on, veering off the main trail into denser terrain. The underbrush clawed at our legs, and the fading light made it harder to see. The deeper we went, the more the sense of unease grew, like the forest itself was trying to warn us to turn back. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a few drops of blood on the leaves, dark and glistening. Then a smear on the bark of a tree, as if someone had grabbed it for support. "Jesus," I muttered, my chest tightening. "You think he's hurt?" "Looks that way," Mike said grimly. "But this is a lot of blood." We followed the trail of crimson deeper into the woods, our flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The sight that greeted us when we entered the clearing will haunt me for the rest of my life. David's body was sprawled in the tall grass, half hidden but unmistakably lifeless. His clothes were shredded, his chest torn open in a grotesque display of ribs and viscera. Bite marks covered his arms and legs, chunks of flesh missing as if he'd been devoured. It wasn't a bear. I'd seen bear attacks before. They're messy, yes, but they have a certain brutality to them, a feral clumsiness. This was different. The wounds were too precise, the pattern too deliberate. Mike knelt near the body, his flashlight illuminating the soft dirt around it. "Coyotes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I followed his gaze to the tracks, dozens of them circling the clearing in chaotic patterns. My throat went dry as I realized what had happened. "They got to him," Mike continued, his tone hollow. "A pack of them. Must have been starving." Coyotes are scavengers by nature, rarely attacking humans unless desperate. Judging by the state of David's body, this pack had been pushed to the brink. "We need to radio this in," I said, my voice shaking. Mike nodded and reached for his radio. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. It was close, too close. We froze, our breaths hitching. Another growl came from behind us, then another from the left. "They're still here," Mike whispered, his hand tightening on the radio. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the trees. Yellow eyes glinted back at me, shifting between the trunks. There were at least 5 of them, their wiry bodies moving like shadows through the underbrush. Their fur was matted, their ribs visible even from a distance. "They're surrounding us," I said, my voice barely audible. "Don't run," Mike said, his tone firm. "Whatever you do, don't run." We backed away from David's body, keeping our flashlights trained on the pack. The coyotes didn't charge, but they didn't retreat either. Their growls grew louder with every step we took. Mike pulled out his flare gun, his hands shaking. "If they get any closer, I'll scare them off." I nodded, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much against a determined pack. Then they lunged. It happened so fast. One moment they were circling, the next they were charging, their teeth bared and their eyes wild. Mike fired the flare, the red light blazing through the trees. The pack hesitated, scattering briefly, but they didn't run far. One of them lunged at me, its jaws snapping shut just inches from my leg. I swung my flashlight with all my strength, the impact sending the coyote yelping back into the shadows. "Go!" Mike shouted, firing another flare. "Get to the trail!" We ran, branches tearing at our clothes and faces as we sprinted through the underbrush. The growls were right behind us, the sound of claws scraping against the dirt too close for comfort. Mike was just ahead of me, shouting and waving his flashlight to keep the coyotes at bay. We broke through the tree line and onto the main trail, our boots skidding on the loose dirt. For a moment I thought we'd made it. Then one of them leapt at me, its teeth sinking into my boot. I screamed and kicked, the force of the blow sending the coyote tumbling back into the darkness. Mike grabbed me and pulled me to my feet, and we ran as fast as our legs would carry us. By the time we reached the trailhead, the pack had disappeared back into the woods, but I could still feel their eyes on us, watching from the darkness. We reported everything when we got back to the station. The body, the tracks, the attack. The higher-ups chalked it up to a freak occurrence, a desperate pack pushed to the brink by starvation. But I knew it was more than that. Those coyotes weren't just hungry. They were something else, something primal, something that didn't belong in this world anymore. I still hear their growls in my dreams, feel their breath on the back of my neck. And every time I step into the woods, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it out. The forest always had its mysteries. whispers carried on the wind, shadows that seemed to move on their own. But for those of us who worked as park rangers, those things became background noise. You learned to shrug it off. I thought I'd seen it all in my decade on the job, but nothing prepared me for the teeth. It started innocuously enough, a simple school field trip, something we hosted every spring. Watching kids get excited about the forest, the animals, even the dirt under their feet always made the chaos worthwhile. I enjoyed seeing their faces light up when they spotted a deer or discovered a frog hiding in the underbrush. That morning was no different. A class of fourth graders arrived, their chatter filling the air as they spilled off the bus. The teacher, Mr. Adams, was a jovial guy, all smiles as he helped herd the kids into groups. I took one half, leading them down one of the older trails, while my partner Kelly took the rest toward the stream. We had barely started our hike when Timmy, a curious boy with a knack for darting ahead, stopped suddenly. "Hey! I found something," he called out, crouching in the dirt. I jogged over, expecting to see a cool rock or maybe a squirrel bone. Instead, he held up a tooth. The tooth was smooth and rounded with deep grooves on the top. It was larger than anything I'd seen from the local wildlife. For a moment I stared at it, my stomach twisting with unease. "Is it from a bear?" Timmy asked, grinning proudly. Mr. Adams crouched beside him, inspecting it. "It's probably a deer's tooth," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Good find, Timmy. Let's move on." I pocketed the tooth, feeling its unsettling weight as we continued. By lunchtime, the oddity had slipped from my mind. 2 days later, Kelly and I were on a routine patrol when a call came through. A hiker had reported a foul smell near one of the lesser-used trails. It wasn't uncommon. Winter often left behind casualties. I assumed we'd find an animal carcass, maybe a deer that didn't make it through the season. What we found wasn't an animal. The body lay face down in the dirt, twisted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and mottled. But it was his head that stopped me cold. The back of his skull had been crushed, caved in like a rotted pumpkin, and his mouth hung open, revealing only dark, empty sockets where his teeth should have been. "Jesus," Kelly whispered, stepping back. "What the hell happened to him?" I couldn't speak. My stomach churned as I stared at the gruesome scene. I'd seen death before, falls, animal attacks, but this was different. When the sheriff arrived, he taped off the area and began his investigation. I mentioned the tooth Timmy had found, hoping it was just a bizarre coincidence. His expression darkened. He asked me to take him to the spot where we'd found it. When we arrived, the clearing was eerily untouched. No signs of struggle, no tracks, just the emptiness of the woods. The sheriff nodded grimly, jotting something in his notebook. Before he left, he gave me a hard look and said, "Be careful out here." The story hit the local papers the next day. Hiker found dead in National Park. They kept it vague. An apparent animal attack, nothing more. There was no mention of the missing teeth. Something didn't sit right with me. The woods felt heavier in the days that followed. The usual rustle of animals in the underbrush was gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even Kelly started to notice it. "Feels like the forest is holding its breath," she said one afternoon. I found myself avoiding that trail, making excuses to patrol other areas. But the unease followed me. One night, as I was locking up the ranger station, I heard it. A faint clicking sound like teeth tapping together. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound came again, closer this time. I shone the light toward the trailhead, but the beam revealed only trees swaying gently in the wind. The clicking stopped, but the forest seemed to hold its breath. Kelly wasn't immune to the unease either. She started mentioning strange noises on her patrols. Whispers, faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind. We both requested reassignment to different areas of the park, but the woods had already marked us. One evening, Kelly and I were finishing a late patrol when we heard it again. The clicking. It echoed through the trees, growing louder, closer. "Did you hear that?" Kelly whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding us. We turned, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the beam only deepened the shadows. A rustling sound came from the underbrush, followed by the faintest glint of something white. "Run!" I whispered. We bolted, the clicking sound chasing us down the trail. Branches tore at my arms as we sprinted through the forest, the sound growing louder, more insistent. I didn't dare look back. We reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind us. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. Kelly sat on the floor, her face buried in her hands. The clicking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. We reported the incident, but the higher-ups dismissed it as overactive imaginations. Stress, they said. Too many late nights in the woods, but we knew better. I haven't set foot on that trail since, but the memories linger. The sound of clicking teeth haunts my dreams, a constant reminder of what lurks in the shadows. Sometimes late at night I hear it again, a faint tapping sound just outside my window.